The notification arrived not as a summer letter, but as a terse, impersonal email from a solicitor's office Marcus had never heard of. His great-aunt, a distant relative he barely remembered, had passed. Her estate, Blackwood Manor, was now his. Marcus, a historian whose life revolved around the dry, verifiable facts of the past, found the news more an inconvenience than a cause for grief. Sentimentality was a luxury he rarely indulged, reclusion a necessity for his work. He preferred the quiet hum of his archives, the scent of aged paper, to the unpredictability of human interaction. Blackwood Manor, the name itself carried a faint, almost theatrical chill, a quality Marcus dismissed as provincial melodrama. Local legends, the solicitor's brief attachment explained, painted a picture of a place steeped in misfortune, a house that consumed its inhabitants. Marcus skimmed the hyperbolic accounts, noting the lack of verifiable sources, the reliance on folktales. He filed them away as quaint, superstitious nonsense, a common byproduct of isolated communities and vivid imaginations. He would sell the place, of course, liquidate the asset and return to his meticulously ordered existence. The journey began with a long train ride, followed by an even longer drive through increasingly desolate landscapes. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track that wound through skeletal forests. The air grew heavy, damp, carrying the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. The driver, a taciturn man whose face seemed permanently etched with resignation, offered no conversation, which suited Marcus perfectly. He watched the dwindling light outside, the encroaching shadows of ancient trees, and felt a familiar intellectual detachment. This was research, in a way, observing the physical manifestation of rural isolation. They reached a border checkpoint as dusk bled across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised purples and grays. It was a ranch-aqual structure of corrugated metal and rough-hewn timber, positioned at a narrow gorge where the road barely clung to the cliff face. A single, flickering fluorescent tube cast an anemic glow on the barrier arm. An officer, his uniform faded and ill-fitting, emerged from the booth, his face obscured by the peak of his cap. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his gaze sweeping over the vehicle, then settling on Marcus. Purpose of visit? The officer's voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Inheritance. Blackwood Manor, Marcus stated, producing the solicitor's official letter. The officer took the document, his fingers surprisingly thick and calloused. He read it, or perhaps merely stared at the official seal, for an unnervingly long moment. A peculiar scent, like damp earth mixed with something acrid and metallic, emanated from him. Marcus felt a flicker of impatience, then a subtle, unbidden prickle of unease. The man's scrutiny felt less like official procedure and more like a silent assessment. Finally, the officer returned to the letter. The manor, he said, the words hanging in the still air. There was no warning in his tone, no explicit advice, just a pronouncement quiet. The driver merely nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. As they passed, Marcus glanced back. The impression lingered, a sense of being observed, weighed, and found wanting. The final stretch of road was barely more than a forgotten path, overgrown with weeds and moss. The trees pressed in, their branches weaving a dense, impenetrable canopy that swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. When the driver finally braked, the sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the engine's cooling ticks. Blackwood Manor loomed before them, a hulking silhouette against a sky now bruised black. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, clawed its way up the walls, a suffocating green shroud. He didn't offer to help with the luggage, his gaze fixed on the imposing structure. A palpable reluctance radiated from him. Marcus stepped out. The gravel crunched under his boots. He looked up at the manor. It was an architectural anachronism, a relic of a bygone era, certainly. But there was something more, a quality that went beyond mere age and neglect. The house didn't just stand there. It seemed to settle into the earth, drawing the very light out of the air around it. Its presence was not merely passive, it felt watchful. He dismissed the thought. An old house, isolated in the gloom of night, could play tricks on anyone's perception. He was a rational man. He was Marcus. He would find the key, unlock the door, and begin the process of cataloging its contents. That was all. He told himself it was just the ground settling. He told himself it was nothing. The final stretch of road was a rutted track, barely wide enough for the vehicle. Marcus braced himself against the worn upholstery as the sedan lurched and groaned, climbing a final steep incline. Ahead, a jagged silhouette against the bruised twilight, stood the manor. It was larger than photographs conveyed, a sprawling, asymmetrical structure of dark stone and skeletal timber, its gables sharp as broken teeth. No light emanated from its windows, which stared out like vacant eyes. The driver pulled the sedan to a halt on a gravel sweep that crunched under the tires like shattered bone. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through unseen trees and the distant, mournful cry of a bird. "This is it," the driver stated, his voice flat. He did not look at Marcus. His gaze was fixed on the Manor's imposing facade. Marcus noted the man's hands, still gripping the steering wheel, knuckles pale beneath taut skin. He didn't offer to help with the luggage, a stack of heavy boxes filled with Marcus's research materials. Marcus retrieved his bags and the first few boxes, the weight familiar and comforting. He had packed his life's work into these containers, a portable library of forgotten histories. The driver, without another word, reversed sharply, tires spitting gravel, and sped back down the track, leaving Marcus alone in the encroaching gloom. The sound of the engine faded quickly, absorbed by the vast emptiness. A chill, not entirely from the evening air, prickled Marcus's skin. He looked at the Manor. He located the heavy iron key in his pocket, its cold metal a stark contrast to his thumb. The lock protested with a groan of rusted tumblers, then surrendered. The air inside was thick and stagnant, carrying the scent of dust, damp stone, and something else, something indefinable like old paper and forgotten time. He returned to the car's last position, retrieving more boxes. The process was slow, methodical. Each trip from the gravel to the Manor's threshold deepened his awareness of the isolation. Inside, he found a switch near the entryway. A single, bare bulb flickered to life in the ceiling of the grand hall, cast in weak, jaundiced light onto peeling wallpaper and a wide, dust-shrouded staircase. The staircase curved upwards into obscurity, a silent invitation to the upper floors. Marcus ignored it for now. His priority was his work. He selected a large, relatively intact room on the ground floor, its bay window overlooking a tangle of overgrown gardens. This would be his study. He began to unpack, methodically arranging his books, files, and research notes onto the sturdy, if grimy, mahogany desk he found pushed against one wall. He liked order, structure, the certainty of documented fact. He paused, his hand hovering. The air in the rest of the room felt merely cool, but this spot was glacial, as if someone had opened a freezer door for a fleeting second. He frowned. "Drafts," he muttered, examining the window. The panes were old, certainly, but sealed tight. He attributed it to the sheer age of the structure, the inherent inefficiencies of ancient architecture. It sounded like brittle leaves skittering across a stone floor, or perhaps dry paper being disturbed. Marcus listened intently. The sound did not repeat. He concluded it was the house settling, the old timbers shifting, or possibly a mouse scurrying within the walls. He made a mental note to investigate pest control options. At one point, he set down a particularly rare, leather-bound volume on the desk, intending to consult a specific passage. He turned to retrieve a magnifying glass from a nearby box, a process that took mere seconds. When he turned back, the book had shifted. It lay open, not to the page he had been examining, but to a completely different section, its spine now facing slightly askew. Marcus stared at it. He was certain he had placed it closed, perfectly aligned with the desk's edge. He picked it up, ran his thumb over the aged cover. He must be more tired than he thought. A momentary lapse, a misremembered action. His mind, he reminded himself, was a complex, fallible mechanism prone to minor distortions under stress or fatigue. He closed the book and replaced it precisely where he intended it to be. He continued unpacking, pulling a heavy trunk from beneath a dusty sheet in a recessed alcove. It contained mostly old linens and moth-eaten tapestries. But at the very bottom, beneath layers of faded fabric, he discovered a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was locked. He found a tiny, tarnished key on a string, tucked into a fold of velvet lining. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry, crumbling rose petals, were several small, bound journals and a sheaf of brittle, yellowed letters. The script was spidery, almost illegible in places, but Marcus could discern the dates, late 18th century, early 19th. He recognized the names of some of the Manor's previous owners, figures he had encountered in his preliminary research. He picked up the first journal. The paper crackled like dry autumn leaves. The entries were sporadic, rambling, filled with increasingly frantic observations. One passage, dated 1798, caught his eye. "The house watches. I feel it drawing the substance from my thoughts, blurring the lines of what I know to be true." Another entry, a few pages later, read, "My father, he spoke of the hunger. I dismissed it then. The thirst is real. If he is on the mind, on the very essence of being. I am losing myself to its embrace." Marcus's brow furrowed. He recognized the florid prose common to the era, but the content was undeniably unsettling. He considered the possibility of mental instability on the part of the original author. Many reclusive landowners, isolated by choice or circumstance, often succumbed to eccentricities, even delusions. This was a historical document, a window into the psyche of a troubled individual, nothing more. He placed the journal carefully on the desk next to his meticulously organized research. He would analyze it properly, apply his scholarly lens to its peculiar narrative. A gust of wind rattled the large bay window, a sound that seemed to carry a faint, drawn-out sigh. The single bulb in the ceiling flickered, then brightened again. Marcus shivered, a reflex. He was tired. The long journey, the unsettling isolation, the sheer volume of his work. It was all contributing to an overwrought imagination. He pushed the thought away, turning back to the cryptic journals, the faint unease, a persistent, though still minor, dissonance in the quiet hum of the house. Marcus's fingers, stained with the fine dust of ages, traced the faded ink of the 18th century diary. The previous entry, full of florid declarations of a malignant spirit and walls that wept sorrows, had struck him as the ramblings of a solitary mind, perhaps exacerbated by a life of self-imposed isolation. He had catalogued similar accounts from other historical properties, attributing them to lead poisoning in water systems, inherited melancholia, or simply the psychological toll of profound solitude. Yet, the sheer consistency of the dread described within these pages, spanning decades, presented a data point he could not entirely ignore. He shifted in the worn armchair, the springs groaning beneath him. The library was a cavern of shadows, the last slivers of afternoon light barely penetrating the grimy window panes. A faint scratching sound emanated from the wall beside him, a rhythmic, almost deliberate scraping. Marcus paused, listening. It ceased. He dismissed it as a rodent, perhaps, or the settling of old timber. The manor was a symphony of such noises, one learned to filter them. He returned to his transcription, the quill scratching softly on his notepad. He froze, head cocked. Nothing. He blinked, rubbing his temples. Fatigue, he concluded. The late nights, the meticulous deciphering of archaic scripts, the constant mental exertion, it was taking its toll. It was gone before he could fully turn his head, a momentary distortion of the gloom. He stopped, scanning the empty corridor. The sconces cast pools of weak light, leaving vast stretches in obscurity. A trick of the eye, he decided, caused by the failing light and his own exhaustion. His determination remained unwavering. Every anomalous perception would be subjected to rigorous, scientific scrutiny. That night, sleep offered no respite. He dreamed of vast, empty rooms, the air thick with an unspoken expectation. In the dream, the walls themselves seemed to breathe, their surfaces rippling with a barely perceptible movement. He heard a chorus of hushed voices, their words indistinct, like a conversation held just beyond the threshold of hearing. The sensation was not one of being alone, but of being relentlessly observed. He woke abruptly, the taste of dry ash in his mouth, the faint echo of those murmurs still clinging to the edges of his awareness. He checked the time, 3:17 a.m. Another instance of disturbed rest. The following day, Marcus intensified his research, moving beyond personal diaries to official records, property deeds, and correspondence related to previous owners. He sought patterns, statistical anomalies. What he found began to unravel his carefully constructed rationalizations. The manor's history was punctuated by an alarming frequency of misfortune. A gentleman farmer in the late 1700s, after a decade of residing within the walls, had been found wandering the estate, muttering about hungry stones and voices in the mortar, before disappearing without a trace. A century later, a reclusive scholar, much like Marcus himself, had meticulously documented his descent into profound paranoia, scribbling frantic notes about an unseen presence that drank his thoughts before ultimately taking his own life. In the library had progressively alienated him, staff and family, convinced they were conspiring against him. Letters filled with accusations of the house influencing their minds. He too vanished. Fate never resolved. The pattern was undeniable. Prolonged isolation within the manor invariably preceded episodes of escalating psychological distress, culminating in madness, disappearance, or suicide. The common thread was not external pressure or shared genetic predisposition, but the house itself. He discovered a particularly unsettling document, a hastily scrawled letter from a former caretaker, dated 1937, addressed to a distant relative. The caretaker had served the manor for decades, witnessing several of these tragic events. Marcus felt its eyes not on me, but through me, assessing the intentions of the official, measuring my resolve. It was as if a part of the house had followed, an invisible tendril reaching across the land, ensuring that no one truly escapes its influence. Marcus turned back. The clinical detachment he had so carefully cultivated began to fray. The implications were staggering. This was not mere superstition, not a string of coincidences. They were the house's preliminary overtures. Marcus stood in the library, the last words of the journal echoing in the cavernous space. That net milia de da. The incomplete sentence hung, a severed nerve ending, a sudden, brutal amputation of understanding. His clinical detachment, once a robust shield, now felt like a brittle pane of glass, already fractured. He ran a hand over the cold, polished oak of a nearby shelf, seeking a grounding sensation. The implications were staggering. Pushing against the carefully constructed walls of his rational mind, a faint tremor ran through the floorboards beneath his feet, a low thrum that vibrated up his spine. It wasn't seismic. It felt deliberate, like a giant animal shifting its weight. The air in the library, previously still, began to stir, carrying with it a scent of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt cloth. Yet, the feeling of being observed intensified. It was not a casual glance, but a deep, penetrating scrutiny, as if the very stones of the manor were assessing him, weighing his resolve, measuring his essence. He moved from the library, the journal clutched tight in his hand, compelled to explore the upper floors. The grand staircase groaned under his weight, each step a protest. The polished banister felt clammy beneath his palm. He found himself in a long, dim corridor on the second floor, lined with closed doors, each one a potential vault of forgotten suffering. As he paused before a heavy, unadorned door, a flicker disturbed the periphery of his vision. It was a fleeting, indistinct shape, gone before he could properly register it. He blinked, shaking his head. Fatigue, he reasoned. The stress of the inheritance, the isolated location, the unsettling journal entries, it was all taking its toll. Yet the sensation of being watched did not abate. He pushed open the door. Inside was a bedroom, larger than his own, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in heavy, faded velvet. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the drawn curtains. As his gaze swept the room, a vivid image superimposed itself onto his reality. He saw a woman. He was not in the room with him, not truly, but he saw her, as if she were a translucent layer over the present. She clutched a small, leather-bound book to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her gaze darted frantically toward the window, then to the door, a desperate calculation in her eyes. The vision flickered, then solidified. He was no longer just seeing her. He was there. He was standing, but his perspective was skewed, lower, as if he were looking through the woman's eyes for a fleeting moment. Then, just as quickly, it dissolved. Marcus stumbled back against the door frame, gasping. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against his sternum. He wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. This was not a hallucination born of sleep deprivation. This was a projection, a memory seeping from the walls, a scene forcefully replayed. He forced himself to take a deep, shaky breath, trying to reassert control. He was a historian. He dealt with facts, with evidence. This defied all logic, but the detail, the sensory overload, the distinct transfer of emotion, it was too real, too precise, too invasive. He backed out of the room, his gaze sweeping the corridor, half expecting to see the woman again. The journal lay open on the table, its cryptic warnings now seeming less like madness and more like urgent dispatches from a forgotten war. He couldn't focus. Every creak of the house, every rustle of dry leaves against the windows felt amplified, imbued with malevolent intent. He heard it then, a faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump from somewhere above. He strained to listen, his muscles tensing. It wasn't a natural sound. It was too regular, too heavy. It sounded like something being dragged. The sound intensified, now accompanied by a low, guttural moan. It was unmistakable. The sound of suffering. Marcus's mind screamed for a rational explanation. Pipes, settling timbers, the wind. But the moan was too human, too raw, too close to the agony he had just experienced. Each step was a struggle against an unseen force, a growing resistance that made the air feel thick and heavy, like wading through deep water. As he reached the second-floor landing, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. The dragging, the moaning, it was coming from behind that same heavy, unadorned door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His rational mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place. But the historian in him, the part that sought truth, that refused to be deterred by the inexplicable, pushed him forward. He twisted the knob. The room was bathed in a sickly, green-tinged light, not from the windows, but emanating from the very air itself. He was sprawled on the floor, her body contorted, her face a mask of agony. Marcus froze, his breath catching. This was no mere vision. The scene was palpable, real in every horrifying detail. The woman's struggles, the man's brutal strength, the faint, metallic scent of blood. It assaulted his senses. He saw the struggle cease, the woman's body go limp, the vision shimmered, the green light pulsed, and then, as if a curtain had been violently drawn, it vanished. Marcus was left standing in the dusty bedroom, the only sound his own ragged breathing. He stumbled back, hitting the doorframe with a dull thud. His entire body trembled. This was not a memory replayed. It was a memory experienced. The house was not just haunted. It was a living, malevolent entity, replaying its atrocities, feeding on the very act of witnessing, on the fear it generated. He stumbled down the stairs, his mind a whirlwind of images. The woman, the struggle, the man. It had been so real. He reached the main hall, his eyes wide and unfocused, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He needed to leave. His gaze fell upon an old map he had brought with him, spread across his desk. It was a regional map, detailing the local roads and a small, almost forgotten track leading to a distant border checkpoint. The words on the map blurred. He remembered the woman's desperate gaze toward the window, her frantic need to flee. He had been trying to escape, to reach some safety, perhaps that very checkpoint. The house had stopped her. The lines between past and present were not merely blurring, they were dissolving. He was trapped. The manor's memories were not just history. They were a living, breathing, hungry presence, and he was its next meal. He had to leave. The thought arrived with a sudden, jarring clarity, like a single bell chiming in a fog. He needed distance, external validation, the indifferent hum of civilization to recalibrate his perceptions. He walked, rather than drove, toward the main gates, a choice that felt both deliberate and subtly imposed. His boots crunched on the gravel path, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness of the estate. The sky, a uniform gray, offered no relief, no break in the vast, brooding expanse. As he approached the wrought iron barrier, an inexplicable lethargy settled over him, a profound weariness that seeped into his bones. His limbs felt heavy, his mind clouded. The ornate ironwork of the gates, usually a mere boundary, now appeared formidable, almost insurmountable, its cold metal radiating an unseen resistance. The mechanism, usually stiff but operable, seemed to resist his touch with a stubborn, almost sentient reluctance. He pulled, he pushed, he rattled. The gates remained steadfast, refusing to yield. He felt a peculiar resignation, a sense that he was not meant to leave. Not yet. The house, he realized, wanted him to stay. The thought was not alarming, but rather a quiet, insidious acceptance. He retreated, the sense of urgency that had spurred him evaporating like mist. He didn't drive back. He didn't call for assistance. The next day, a renewed determination sparked within him. This was irrational. He was Marcus, the historian, the rationalist. He would not be deterred by an old house and its psychological tricks. He retrieved his car keys, the heavy iron ring feeling alien in his hand. The engine turned over with a surprising ease, a brief moment of normalcy. He drove, the gravel crunching under the tires, past the now open gates, a detail he couldn't quite recall noticing. The road, initially clear, gradually became less defined. The verges overgrown, the tarmac cracked. He had driven this route countless times, yet it felt unfamiliar, subtly altered. The structure was a low, utilitarian building of concrete and corrugated steel, flanked by faded national flags that hung limply in the still air. A single barrier, striped red and white, blocked the road. A uniformed guard, his face obscured by the shadow of his cap, emerged from a small booth. Marcus rolled down his window. The air that wafted in was stale, metallic, and carried the faint tang of exhaust fumes and damp earth. "Good afternoon," Marcus began, his voice sounding thin and reedy in his own ears. "I'm Marcus. Marcus need to get through." The guard stared at him, his expression unreadable. He did not speak. It was as if Marcus were transparent, a phantom. Marcus repeated himself, louder this time, explaining his purpose, his destination, the urgent need for contact with the outside. The guard remained motionless, a statue in faded green. No nod, no gesture, no flicker of recognition. He tried his phone. No signal. He tried again, repeatedly, scrolling through his contacts. The screen remained stubbornly blank, displaying only no service. He peered out at the guard, who had now turned slightly, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond Marcus's car. It was not dismissal, but utter profound non-acknowledgement. He was not being denied passage, he was simply not being perceived. A profound weariness, heavier than before, descended upon him. His shoulders slumped. The world outside the manor, he realized, was not rejecting him. It was simply absent. It felt as though a curtain had been drawn, not over the world, but over his own ability to interact with it. He started the car again, the engine a low growl of defeat. He turned the vehicle around, the gravel spitting under the tires, and drove back the way he had come. The border checkpoint receded in his rearview mirror, becoming a distant, indistinct smudge. Returning to the manor, a strange comfort settled over him. The air inside felt warmer, thicker, more substantial than the thin, insubstantial air outside. He shed his jacket, letting it fall to the floor in the hallway. He didn't pick it up. He didn't bother with a meal. The thought of food seemed distant, irrelevant. He ran a hand through his hair, finding it greasy and matted. He hadn't showered in days. He wandered back to the library, to the journal. He sat in the worn leather chair, the scent of dust and old parchment filling his nostrils. It had called his back. It was possessive, yes, but also strangely comforting, like an ancient, all-encompassing guardian. It drained him, he knew. Yet, there was a quiet, undeniable allure in this surrender. The external world, with its demands and complexities, seemed to recede, becoming a faint, unimportant echo. Here, within these walls, there was only the house and him, and the deepening quiet that consumed everything else. Marcus stood, his breath a shallow rasp in the cold air, the guard's dark, unblinking eyes fixed on a point beyond him. He had explained, articulated, detailed his journey and his destination, the ancient manor, his inheritance, his academic pursuit. Yet, the guard remained motionless, a statue carved from the gray morning light, his face an impassive mask. Marcus's voice, which had begun with a historian's measured cadence, had fractured into an insistent plea, then a desperate whisper. His words seemed to fall into a vacuum, absorbed by the oppressive silence that clung to the border checkpoint. It was the unnerving sensation that he was dissolving, that his presence was an optical illusion the guard simply refused to acknowledge. He reached out, a tentative hand hovering inches from the guard's uniform, intending to elicit a reaction, a flicker of recognition. His fingers brushed against empty air. The guard was still there, yet not there. The border checkpoint, too, had vanished. He stood not on a wind-swept road, but within a long, narrow corridor. Stone walls, rough and ancient, rose on either side, meeting overhead in a low, vaulted ceiling. There was no memory of transition, no understanding of how he had moved from the desolate checkpoint to this claustrophobic passage. He must have drifted, sleepwalked. He dismissed the thought instantly. He was lucid, or was he? He paused, listening. The humming had stopped, but a faint, rhythmic creaking echoed from deeper within the passage. The house was settling, or perhaps something within it was stirring. A sudden, jarring thought. This passage was not here yesterday. He was certain. The manor had its eccentricities, its forgotten rooms, but this labyrinthine stretch felt alien, an organic growth rather than an architectural design. It dissolved, edges blurring, rooms shifting positions, walls appearing and disappearing in his mind's eye. He turned a corner, and a small, heavy wooden door, previously unseen, now stood ajar. A sliver of amber light spilled from within. He pushed it open, revealing a study, rich with the smell of old leather and pipe tobacco. A fire crackled merrily in a hearth, casting a warm glow over a cluttered desk. Parchment scrolls lay unfurled, quill pens rested in an inkwell, and a half-finished letter, its script elegant and spidery, lay open. Marcus walked towards the desk, a strange sense of recognition washing over him. He picked up the letter. The words, though unfamiliar, resonated with a deep, unsettling familiarity. It spoke of political unrest, of anxieties regarding a distant war, of the burden of the estate. He saw the signature, Elias, a name he knew from the manor's history, a past resident, a scholar and recluse from centuries ago. He looked down at his own hand, holding the letter. His skin felt strangely smooth, unblemished by the minor cuts and scrapes he usually accumulated during his explorations. His fingers, long and slender, seemed different. He raised his hand, turning it over, observing the faint tracery of veins beneath the pale skin. This was his hand, of course. He looked at the desk, at the books, at the very air of the room. A profound weariness settled over him, a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to come from decades of scholarly pursuit, of solitary nights spent by the fire. He remembered the feeling of writing that letter, the precise weight of the quill, the faint scent of the ink. He remembered the anxieties, the sense of isolation. No, these were not his memories. He was Marcus, a historian. He had inherited this place, but the clarity was fleeting, like a ripple in murky water. He glanced towards the mirror above the mantelpiece. A man's reflection stared back, not his own face. Not quite. The cheekbones were sharper, the jawline more defined, the eyes a deeper shade of brown. A stranger, yet the expression was undeniably his own, a weary, haunted gaze. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the mirror. The reflected face shifted, blurred, then solidified, becoming his own again. The change was so subtle, so seamless, that he questioned if it had happened at all. Perhaps the light had played tricks. Perhaps his mind was simply tired. He retreated from the study, the feeling of profound displacement growing with each step. The corridor outside was different now, but the house seemed to resist, its architecture a fluid, malicious puzzle. A door he remembered finding led to a staircase that descended into absolute blackness. Another, a familiar archway, now opened onto a small, dusty pantry he'd never seen before, filled with empty jars and a faint, sweet smell of decay. This wasn't just disorientation, where are you? The words felt natural on his tongue, a desperate plea for a presence that had ceased to exist centuries ago. The house responded with a low, groaning sigh, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very stone and timber, closing around him like a tightening fist. The guard remained his silhouette against the low, bruised light of dawn, his gaze locked beyond Marcus, past the dusty vehicle, into the hazy distance. Marcus had reiterated his purpose, his destination, the legal documents of inheritance folded neatly in his jacket pocket. No sound emerged from the guard, no shift in posture. His uniform, dark and severe, seemed to absorb what little light attempted to touch it. Marcus, after a prolonged, unsettling silence that stretched the tendons in his neck, engaged the clutch. The engine idled with a low thrum. He slowly, deliberately, began to move the vehicle forward. The barrier, a thick metal arm that had been firmly down moments before, began to rise with a faint, hydraulic hiss as if operated by an unseen mechanism. Marcus did not look back. The drive to Blackwood Manor felt different now. The road, once familiar in its desolation, seemed to narrow, the trees pressing closer, their branches' skeletal fingers scraping at the indifferent sky. He had dismissed the local superstitions as the ramblings of uneducated villagers, yet the unmoving guard and the silently rising barrier had introduced a discordant note, a tiny, unsettling tremor in his carefully constructed skepticism. Its windows, like vacant eyes, watched his approach. The heavy oak door, which he had left slightly ajar, now stood firmly closed as if it had never been disturbed. Inside, the air was thicker, heavier than he remembered, carrying a new, cloying sweetness that reminded him vaguely of overripe fruit mingled with the pervasive scent of dust and decay. He moved through the echoing halls, his footsteps swallowed by the worn tapestries and ancient rugs. His academic determination, a stubborn refusal to be swayed by mere atmosphere, propelled him. There had to be more, a deeper layer to the manor's history. Something beyond the fragmented notes he had already uncovered. He sought the manor's core, its true genesis. He began his search in the library, a room he had previously catalogued but not yet fully explored. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light that pierced the grimy windows, a silent, swirling cosmos. The shelves, groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes, stretched to the high, vaulted ceiling. His fingers, now accustomed to the film of grime, traced the spines, searching for anything out of place, any hidden compartment. Behind a particularly dense section of theological texts, his fingers brushed against a loose panel. It yielded with a dry, protesting creak, revealing a narrow recess. Inside, nestled amongst layers of ancient velvet, was a single, unbound journal. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, its pages yellowed and thin. There was no title, no author. He carried it to a sturdy oak table, the wood cool beneath his palms. The first entries were precise observations of the manor's architecture, its gardens, its surrounding lands. The handwriting was neat, scholarly, detailing the life of a previous inhabitant, a cartographer who had lived in the manor in the late 17th century. The cartographer, like Marcus, had been an academic, drawn to the manor's isolation for intellectual pursuits. Then, the tone shifted. Subtle at first, a growing unease. The cartographer noted a peculiar lethargy, a strange forgetfulness, the fading of certain details. He wrote of waking with a profound sense of exhaustion, as if his mind had been active all night without his conscious participation. He mentioned the manor's unnatural quiet, its consuming stillness. Marcus's breath hitched. He recalled his own recent bouts of mental fog, the way certain memories felt just beyond his grasp. The journal's entries grew more frantic. The handwriting became erratic, the lines slanting across the page. It takes from me, one entry read. The ink smeared as if the writer's hand had trembled violently. Not possessions, not blood, my thoughts, my past. The cartographer described the manor as a hungry maw, a sentient architecture that draws sustenance from the living mind. He wrote of the feeling of his memories being siphoned, a banquet for the stone and timber. Marcus's eyes scan ahead, his gaze snagging on a specific passage. It grows stronger with each meal. The more lucid the mind, the richer the feast. It prefers the vibrant, the aware, the knowing. He looked up from the journal, his vision blurring slightly. The room, once a mere collection of objects, now seemed to possess a palpable presence. The dust motes in the light beams no longer danced. They drifted, slow and deliberate, like microscopic organisms in a viscous medium. The cloying sweetness in the air intensified, pressing against his sinuses. His own memories felt suddenly fragile, like brittle glass. He tried to recall the face of his research assistant, a colleague from the university, but the details were indistinct, hazy. He closed his eyes, forcing the image, but it remained stubbornly out of reach. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over him. Not physical fatigue, but a deep, mental weariness that threatened to collapse his consciousness. The journal's final entry was a single, scrawled sentence, almost illegible. It knows I know. At the feasts, Marcus understood. The manor was not merely haunted. It was a living, predatory entity. Its walls, its floors, its very air were conduits for a slow, insidious consumption. It fed on the essence of its inhabitants, their memories, their sanity, their life force. And he, Marcus, with his determined intellect, his vast reservoir of historical knowledge, his acute awareness, was its current preferred meal. He was the next course. The clinical detachment he so valued, his academic rigor, had only made him a more delectable feast. The manor was not just around him, it was in him, a slow, insatiable hunger already at work. He could feel it. Not with his determined intellect had been the perfect vessel for its slow, insidious consumption. It was like a sudden, frigid draft through a sealed room. The manor's tendrils, previously indistinguishable from his own consciousness, momentarily recoiled. He saw them for what they were. Foreign, invasive filaments woven through his memory, his perception. A jolt of primal fear, pure and unadulterated by the manor's influence, coursed through him. He was being devoured, piece by piece, and he understood with a chilling certainty that the process was nearing completion. His mind, for an instant, was his own again. Not the fractured echo it had become, but the keen, analytical instrument that had dismissed local legends and sought empirical truths. This was a fragile, precious window. The knowledge he now possessed that the manor was a sentient, predatory entity was a weapon, if he could only wield it. He pushed himself from the heavy, velvet armchair in the study, his movements stiff, uncoordinated, as if his muscles were relearning their purpose. A thin film of dust, disturbed by his rising, shimmered in the weak light filtering through the grimy window panes. The air itself felt thick, cloying, tasting of dry rot and something metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. He had to find a way to stop it, to sever the connection, to break free. Or, failing that, to destroy it utterly. Now, they felt like clues in a desperate, final game. He needed to find a countermeasure. Something from the manor's own past, a forgotten vulnerability. The house had been here for centuries. Surely, others had faced this threat. Had anyone resisted? Had anyone survived? He stumbled towards his desk, his fingers fumbling through the stacks of his notes, the brittle, yellow documents retrieved from the manor's sealed archives. The words blurred, swam before his eyes. He fought against the encroaching fog, against the insidious whispers that suggested surrender, that promised peace in oblivion. Focus, he commanded himself. The word a raw, desperate rasp in his throat. He remembered a recurring motif in some of the older, more obscure texts, references to thresholds and passages that were more than mere architectural features. One particularly cryptic passage spoke of a border checkpoint within the manor, a place of historical significance where ownership had been contested, identities verified, and often bloodshed. He had dismissed it as metaphorical flourish, a poet's embellishment of a property dispute. Now, the words resonated with a terrifying new meaning. His gaze landed on a small, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a faded, intricate sigil he hadn't recognized before. It wasn't among his usual research materials. He didn't recall ever having seen it. He picked it up. He opened it, his fingers trembling. The script inside was tight, precise, archaic. It was the handwriting of a former inhabitant, a woman named Alara, who had lived in the manor during a period of intense upheaval centuries ago. Her entries chronicled not merely the house's daily life, but its insidious influence. She detailed the slow erosion of her family, the disappearance of memories, the suffocating presence that thickened with each passing season. Then he found it, a series of entries, frantic and desperate, describing a specific location within the manor, a forgotten antechamber, situated between the original keep and a later edition. She wrote of strange currents of air, a palpable shift in the atmosphere, and a lingering scent of ozone and iron. She recounted how, in a moment of desperate lucidity, she perceived this passage as a literal checkpoint, complete with spectral figures demanding identity, demanding tribute. Alara's final entries spoke of an artifact, not a weapon, but a focus. A small, intricately carved obsidian shard, described as the Black Mirror. She believed it could reflect the manor's true nature, reveal its vulnerabilities, and perhaps, if used correctly, disrupt its feeding cycle. She wrote of a ritual, a confluence of specific words, a precise alignment of the shard with a particular constellation, and a terrible personal sacrifice required to activate it. The language was veiled, coded, hinting at a deep, personal cost that made Marcus's stomach clench. The obsidian shat, the ritual, the sacrifice. It was a terrifying, almost impossible prospect. But it was something. It was a glimmer of resistance, a thread of hope woven into a tapestry of despair. The manor pulsed around him, its presence growing heavier as if sensing his defiance. The location of the gatekeeper's passage was vaguely described, but he knew the layout of the manor intimately. He could find it, and he would find the Black Mirror. A grim resolve hardened his features, pushing back against the encroaching fear. This was his chance, a slim, terrifying chance to fight back against an entity that sought to erase him, to consume him entirely. The price, Alara implied, would be steep. But what was the alternative? To fade into nothingness, another forgotten meal for the house? Marcus refused. The tendrils, previously indistinguishable from the pervasive gloom, now asserted themselves. Marcus felt a sudden, profound resistance, like a deep-sea current pushing against his very consciousness. The fleeting clarity had been a declaration of war. The manor, a colossal, ancient predator, was no longer content with subtle persuasion. It would now fight. He stood in the long gallery, a space he knew intimately, yet it felt alien. The portraits, once faded oil and canvas, seemed to shift their gazes, their eyes following him with a wet, predatory gleam. He had intended to retrace his steps to the study, to verify the crumbling ledger's cryptic entries, but the path ahead twisted. A door, which should have opened into the west wing corridor, was now a solid expanse of dark, unblemished wood. No handle, no hinges, just a flat, unyielding surface where a portal had always been. Marcus reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth timber. He pushed, then hammered with his fists. The wood offered no give, absorbing the impact without a tremor. A cold, damp breath ghosted past his ear, carrying the scent of grave soil and something metallic, like old blood. He spun, his eyes scanning the empty gallery. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him, stealing the oxygen from his lungs. The portrait's eyes seemed to narrow, their painted lips drawing back in silent snarls. It dug in, sharp and insistent, threatening to tear. He flinched away, stumbling back, his mind grappling with the impossible. No, he rasped, the word tasting like rust. This was not a haunting. This was an active, malevolent will. The manor was not merely inhabited. It was the inhabitant. He turned, seeking another exit. The grand double doors leading to the main hall, usually ajar, were now sealed shut. He could see the intricate carvings of the coat of arms, but the brass handles were gone, replaced by an unbroken surface. He moved with a desperate urgency, checking every archway, every alcove. The walls themselves began to groan, a low, grinding sound that resonated through his bones. He reached a spiral staircase, one he remembered descending countless times. As he placed his foot on the first step, the wood beneath him groaned ominously, then twisted. The entire structure seemed to ripple, the stone banister dissolving into a cascade of dust and phantom light. The descent was gone. He was trapped. The realization settled in his gut like a stone. The house was playing with him, hurting him. He understood now. It was not merely feeding on his memories, but on his will to resist, his sanity, his very identity. A blinding flash erupted in the air before him, not of light, but of memory. He saw himself, younger, vibrant, standing before a stark, concrete edifice. A heavy gate, a guarded booth, a sign, stark and official, read, Border checkpoint. He felt the gnawing anxiety of uncertain passage, the scrutiny of impassive faces, the weight of officialdom. The memory was not his own, or rather, it was his, but overlaid with an intensity that felt foreign, amplified. He heard the brusque questions of an unseen officer, the rustle of official papers, the silent judgment. The manor was showing him his fate, presenting him with a psychological border he could not cross, a finality of identity erasure. He stumbled forward, driven by a primal need to escape this suffocating, sentient prison. He ran towards it, his breath ragged, his legs aching. The light led him to a small antechamber he had never seen before. It was circular, with a single, high window through which a pale, sickly moonlight filtered. In the center of the room, on a pedestal, rested a single, ancient, leather-bound volume. It was the same ledger he had been seeking, the one with the cryptic entries. The walls of the antechamber began to contract, the stone groaning, slowly, inexorably, closing in around him. He could hear the faint, triumphant laughter of 1,000 lost voices echoing from the very fabric of the house. He was no longer trying to escape. He was trying to breathe. The colossal, ancient predator asserted itself. He stood in the great hall, the air around him thickening, viscous and cold. It was not merely the cold of an old house. It was the chill of a vast, indifferent hunger. His resolve, brittle but unyielding, sharpened. He understood, with a historian's grim acceptance of fact, that he was already within the beast's maw. Retreat was an illusion. He clutched the heavy, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his meticulous research, his attempts to chart the manor's insidious history. The house groaned around him, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in his bones. It was not the creaking of old timbers, it was a living sound, the respiration of a colossal organism. He passed through the dining room, where the table lay set for a meal long since spoiled, the air thick with the phantom scent of decay and something else, something metallic and acrid, like old blood in a forgotten cistern. The silverware, tarnished black, seemed to writhe in the dim light. The grand staircase, usually a formidable structure, now appeared to undulate. Each step upward felt like an ascent against a powerful current. He knew they were lures, attempts to fragment his focus, to draw him into the house's labyrinthine mental corridors. He sought the oldest parts of the structure, the foundational stones, the deepest memories the manor possessed. His research had pointed to a specific section, an area sealed off for centuries, mentioned only in the most obscure, fragmented accounts. The walls were no longer wallpapered or paneled. They were rough-hewn stone, sweating with condensation. The floor was uneven, patched with flagstones that shifted beneath his weight. A low, persistent hum intensified, a deep resonance that seemed to emanate from the very rock. Ahead, the corridor terminated abruptly, not in a wall, but in an archway that appeared to be carved directly from the living stone. This was the threshold, the border checkpoint. He paused, bracing himself against the unseen force that pushed back, a profound mental and physical repulsion. His mind screamed for retreat, for the sanity of open air and verifiable facts. But he had crossed too many borders already. This was the final one. He reached the archway. The stone on either side pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly green light that seemed to breathe. Beyond it, there was not a room, but a vast, echoing emptiness, a cavernous space whose dimensions defied logic. The ground beneath his feet was smooth, obsidian-like, reflecting the faint, pulsing green. This was the core, the heart of the manor's malevolence. He saw, or rather felt, the tendrils of its hunger, invisible currents that tugged at his identity, attempting to unravel the threads of his consciousness. Marcus took a shaky breath, the cold air burning his lungs. His plan, born of desperation and a historian's belief in the power of truth, felt fragile, almost childish. He intended to assert a different narrative to counter the house's predatory consumption with the unyielding weight of documented reality, to disrupt its feeling by denying it the subjective reality it craved. As he raised the journal, the obsidian floor beneath him began to ripple. The green luminescence intensified, bathing the cavern in an otherworldly glow. The hum deepened, becoming a roar that vibrated through his very bones, threatening to shatter him. The tendrils, no longer merely psychological, felt like physical restraints, tugging at his limbs, pulling at his mind. He was no longer merely confronting the house. He was immersed in its primal, consuming intellect, a horrifying, vast intelligence that sought to devour him whole. He felt his memories fraying at the edges, his sense of self blurring, the lines between Marcus the historian and the myriad forgotten inhabitants of the manor beginning to dissolve. This was the true horror, not just death, but utter obliteration of identity. The air around Marcus, already heavy with the dust of ages and the scent of decay, solidified into a viscous medium. It pressed against his skin, a palpable, invisible force, not merely pushing but attempting to permeate. It was the sound of a vast, hungry organism, its digestive processes accelerating. The clarity he'd grasped, the raw understanding of the manor's true nature, had been a spark in the darkness, but now that darkness was asserting itself, extinguishing the flame. It was not merely a house. It was a vast, ancient predator, and he was caught in its maw. He refused to yield. A fierce, desperate resolve hardened in his chest. The walls began to ripple. Memories, not his own, began to bleed into his perception. Fragments of conversations, the clatter of cutlery from long-vanished dinners, the mournful sigh of a forgotten resident. They were not mere images. It carried the emotional residue of their originators, a sickening tide of grief, longing, and despair that threatened to drown his own consciousness. His thoughts, his very sense of self, felt like sand eroding under a relentless current. He clenched his fists, knuckles white, digging his nails into his palms. No, he rasped, the words swallowed by the house's pervasive hum. He needed an anchor, a tether to his own reality. He focused on the rough texture of the stone beneath his boots, the sharp, metallic tang of his own fear in his mouth. The house responded with a surge. The floor beneath him bucked, not with seismic force, but with a sickening, internal shift, like organs rearranging themselves. The air grew impossibly cold, then searingly hot, alternating in rapid, disorienting waves. They pleaded, they wept, they shrieked, all begging for release, for oblivion, for the return of a self long since assimilated. Marcus felt them clawing at the edges of his mind, trying to pull him into their collective despair. He stumbled forward, driven by an instinct he barely recognized as his own. He knew, with an awful certainty, that he was approaching a critical threshold, a point of no return. The great hall stretched, distorted. The far end, which should have led to the formal dining room, now shimmered, resolving into a crude, monolithic barrier. It was constructed of raw, unworked stone, impossibly smooth, devoid of any architectural feature. This was the border checkpoint. The house was showing him the antechamber to its digestive tract, the point where individual consciousness was stripped away, processed, and incorporated into its vast, sentient memory bank. He understood. This was where identities were catalogued, stamped, and then utterly dissolved. The archway pulsed faintly, drawing him in, promising peace, an end to the torment, a surrender to the collective. He could feel his own memories being scrutinized, catalogued, ready for absorption. His childhood home, his academic triumphs, the faces of his parents, the scent of old books, all were laid bare, ready to be ripped from his grasp. But within that terrible exposure, a spark ignited. His skepticism, his analytical mind, his historian's drive to understand and preserve these were not just his memories. They were the very essence of Marcus. If the house fed on memories, perhaps it could also be choked by them. Not just any memories, but a concentrated, unyielding refusal to be forgotten. He focused on the manor's own history, the very thing he had obsessively studied. He hurled it back at the entity. The dates, the names, the tragedies, the specific architectural details, the precise lineage of its victims. He didn't just remember them, he projected them. A torrent of raw, unedited data, forcing the house to consume its own indigestible past. He visualized the manor's foundations, its deep, ancient roots, its slow, relentless growth through centuries of suffering. It was like a sudden, excruciating indigestion. He was not just resisting, he was causing an internal disturbance. He pressed his advantage, pushing his own will against the house's overwhelming current. He pictured its core, not as an abstract concept, but as the great hall itself, the central ventricle, the heart of its hunger. And he imagined a fracture, a hairline crack radiating from the very center of the hall, spreading through the stone, through the floor, through the walls, not destroying it, but disrupting its perfect, predatory equilibrium. At law, a permanent, aching vulnerability. The ground beneath him convulsed again, more violently this time. A visceral spasm. The air screamed around him, a piercing, inhuman shriek that was both pain and rage. The hum ceased. The visions faded. Marcus stood, gasping, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, his body trembling uncontrollably. The great hall was still, yet irrevocably changed. The border checkpoint was gone, dissolved back into the shimmering, unstable wall that led to the dining room. But something lingered. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the floor. A constant, low thrum that was no longer consuming, but suffering. Marcus looked down at his hands. They were his own. His memories, though frayed and echoing with phantom pains, were still his. He had not been absorbed, but he was not entirely free. He felt a connection, a resonance with the house that had not been there before. He was still Marcus, but something fundamental had shifted. He was now a discordant note in the house's symphony of sorrow, a persistent, irritating presence in its vast, wounded consciousness. He had inflicted a wound, yes, but in doing so, he had become intertwined. The house had absorbed countless, but Marcus had, perhaps, absorbed a fragment of the house itself, a sliver of its pain, its hunger, its ancient, suffering sentience. He was a new kind of resident, and the manor, in its wounded state, was a new kind of prison. The escape he had craved was an illusion. The absorption he had feared was merely altered.